The morning Peter Porco failed to show up for work, no one thought of murder. He was a dependable court clerk in Albany, the kind of man whose absence drew attention because it never happened. When he didn't appear on November 15th, 2004, a court officer drove to his home in Delmar, a quiet suburb of brick houses and trees. The front door was ajar. Inside, the officer stepped into a hallway smeared with blood and followed a trail to a body at the foot of the stairs. Peter lay on his back, shirtless, his head smashed so badly that first responders said he was barely recognizable. Upstairs, his wife Joan lay in bed in a room soaked with blood, breathing but unresponsive. Between the two scenes, investigators found an axe from the family garage, now coated in blood. Detectives quickly realized Peter had not died where he fell. Even with devastating head wounds, he had gotten out of bed after the attack and moved through parts of his usual morning routine. Bloodstains showed his route from the bedroom to the bathroom and then to the kitchen. He packed a lunch, started to load the dishwasher, and tried to leave for work before collapsing in the hall. The story written in blood told investigators that the attack had come while the couple slept and that Peter had kept moving on instinct until his body failed. There was no sign of forced entry. A home security system installed after earlier break-ins had been turned off with the correct code shortly after 2 in the morning. Later, someone cut the outside telephone line, a detail that made the scene look like a staged burglary. Nothing valuable appeared to be missing. The weapon had been taken from the Porco's own garage. To Bethlehem police, this did not look like a stranger slipping in from the street. It looked like the work of someone who knew the house, the code, and the people inside. Peter and Joan had 2 sons. Jonathan, the older, was a Navy officer stationed on a submarine in South Carolina. Christopher, 21, was a student at the University of Rochester, more than 3 hours away. When police reached him, Christopher said he had spent the night of November 14th sleeping in a campus lounge after studying late and woke up to news that something terrible had happened at home. On the surface, it was a simple alibi, but detectives already knew the family had been having serious trouble with him. For several years, Peter and Joan had watched their younger son drift into lies and fraud. In 2002 and 2003, their house had been burglarized twice, with laptops and electronics reported stolen. Investigators eventually concluded those burglaries had been staged and that Christopher himself had taken the items, selling at least one laptop online. The intruder in those earlier cases had cut a screen and tossed a camera into the yard, details that now looked more like props than the work of a real thief. Money lay at the center of the conflict. Christopher had struggled at college and been forced to leave the University of Rochester after poor grades, then returned using a forged community college transcript. To pay for tuition and a yellow Jeep Wrangler, he took out large loans, forging his father's signature as co-signer. Peter learned about the forgeries through letters from banks and confronted his son in sharp emails. He warned that if Christopher abused his credit again, he would file forgery affidavits and cut him off financially. One message ended with a line that later echoed in court. They were disappointed, he wrote, but he and Joan still loved their son and cared about his future. 2 weeks later, someone walked into the Porco home at night and swung an axe repeatedly at the couple in their bed. As officers processed the scene, Joan was rushed to the hospital with massive skull fractures and severe facial injuries. Doctors placed her in a medically induced coma. In the bedroom that first morning before she was moved, Bethlehem detective Christopher Bodish leaned close and asked her questions while paramedics worked around them. He later testified that when he asked if a family member had attacked her, she nodded yes. When he asked if it was Jonathan, she shook her head no. When he asked if it was Christopher, he said she nodded up and down. That brief exchange became the most contested piece of the case. Months later, after waking from the coma, Joan said she had no memory of the attack and insisted she did not believe Christopher had hurt her. She wrote a public letter urging authorities to search for the real killer or killers. At trial, the judge allowed Bodish to describe her nods and headshakes, but Joan herself did not accuse her surviving son. The jury would have to decide how much weight to give to her movements in a bloody bedroom versus her later statements from a hospital and from home. Meanwhile, detectives tested Christopher's story. Surveillance cameras on the University of Rochester campus showed his yellow Jeep leaving around 10:30 p.m. on November 14th and returning shortly after 8 the next morning. Thruway toll collectors between Rochester and Albany recalled a yellow Jeep passing through their booths at times that matched an overnight round trip. Classmates told investigators they had not seen Christopher in the lounge that night. A neighbor in Delmar reported seeing a similar Jeep in the Porco's driveway before dawn. Alarm logs from the house showed that the system had been turned off with the family code in the early hours, and later the telephone line was cut. There were no ransacked drawers and no missing valuables beyond the pattern of the earlier staged burglaries. The axe had come from the garage. Investigators never found blood in Christopher's Jeep, a point his defenders would stress, but his employer, a veterinarian, testified that Christopher had been trained in cleaning up after animal surgeries in ways that left little visible trace. To prosecutors, that explanation fit the rest of the circumstantial picture. In November 2005, 1 year after the attack, a grand jury indicted Christopher Porco on charges of second-degree murder for his father's death and second-degree attempted murder for the attack on his mother. Because Peter worked in the Albany courthouse, local judges recused themselves, and the trial was moved to Orange County. In the summer of 2006, jurors in Goshen heard a case that had drawn intense media attention. The respected clerk found at the bottom of his stairs, the disfigured wife who could not remember, and the son who insisted he had slept 3 hours away while the evidence suggested otherwise. Prosecutors laid out a motive rooted in money and deception and a tight timeline built from toll records and camera footage. They argued that Christopher drove through the night to Delmar, disabled the alarm with the family code, cut the phone line, attacked his parents as they slept, and then drove back to campus in time to appear as a shocked son learning of the crime by phone. They pointed to the staged burglaries, the forged loans, and the emails Peter had sent in the weeks before his death as signs of a young man willing to lie and steal from his own parents to maintain an image and a lifestyle. The defense argued that the investigation had been driven by assumption rather than proof. Attorney Terrence Kindlin stressed that there were no fingerprints on the axe, no blood in the Jeep, and no witness who had seen Christopher with a weapon. On August 10, 2006, after less than a day of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder and attempted murder. That December, Judge Jeffrey Berry sentenced him to consecutive terms of 25 years to life. Today, he is held at Clinton Correctional Facility, while his father is gone and his mother lives with permanent injuries and a memory that cannot fill in the crucial hours of the attack. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.